When we put in a prompt to, an AI tool, we might notice that it produces something really well that would get an A paper, right? And that's when we might want to think about ways in which we can revise the assessment so that students are not offloading, are not doing the cognitive offloading when we don't want them to. So one of this article by John Warner is about, it's very good. I would highly recommend you check it out. It's called We Must Still Make Students Right. And he talks about how, as educators, we are pedagogy problem solvers. I generated this image with AI, and by the way, it was very interesting to try to generate. A lot of biases were coming up when I said create a non-binary superhero with a P on the chest. It kept on producing women with very large, anyway, so it's just very, very interesting. But basically, he talks about how, as pedagogy problem solvers, we constantly think about what do we want students to know? What do we want students to be able to do? What attitudes are we looking to foster? And what are the experiences that will help students engage with these questions? So when we're thinking about our assessments and we notice that AI may produce a really high quality essay, we can think about ways in which we can really hone in on what do we actually want our students to be learning, and how can we help make sure that they are doing that learning. And in some cases, they may be able to use AI to help support that learning. In other cases, perhaps we want to try to limit AI use on certain assessments. It just depends on what we really want them to be learning and doing and the learning outcomes that we're centering our work on. So there's a bunch of different things that we can do. The first is we can think about revising the prompt. So the more that we can, if we're trying to make it so that students aren't using AI on a particular assessment, there's a lot of things that we can do to revise the prompt so that if a student copies and pastes the prompt, it doesn't produce really high quality output. One thing that's really recommended is to increase that Bloom's taxonomy. So when we think about, Bloom's taxonomy, the apply, remember, create, the higher we are on Bloom's taxonomy, the harder it is to simply replicate it with, just a copy and paste in AI. Not always perfectly true, though. That's why it's helpful to just test out our assessments in our AI tool of choice. We can also think about ways in which we're requiring students to refer to class discussions, lectures, or resources. Tools like ChatGPT are trained off of data largely from the internet before 2021. And so the more that we pay attention to the information that they don't have access to, the more it's not going to be able to easily replicate it. And we also want to think about ways in which we can try to create authentic assessments that are meaningful for our students so they have the investment and they actually want to do the assessment. That can go a long way. Any other ideas or thoughts for ways in which we can revise the prompt? We don't have to, or maybe we'll just, as we're going through, try to think about strategies that you might have used in the past or that you might be thinking about playing around with, and we'll share at the end. We can also think about revising the output. So, there's a move towards oral assessments, that could be a more secure assessment. We can think about creating videos if that's something that students that would align with our learning outcomes. We can also provide choice for our students. If we provide choice in the output, maybe they have the buy-in and it really becomes an authentic, meaningful assessment for them. There's also an opportunity for us to emphasize the process. So the more that we can, spread out our assessments over an extended period of time and provide the feedback, reflections that encourage students to describe exactly how they use the feedback. Those are all things that are difficult to offload to an AI tool. And then, of course, I was talking about locking down the assessment. The issue with locking down assessments is that, I mean, we have a lot of students, we're only humans, and it's really not feasible to do for every single assessment. So we really want to think strategically about this. And then if we're thinking about revising to allow AI, I will share when I post the link, I will share these slides as well on the blog. But there are some really helpful guidelines about ways in which we can have students use AI for learning. And we did talk about that a little bit at our successful uses of AI last time as well. And then finally, when we're thinking about the rubrics or how we're assessing learning, we want to think about learning outcomes. And again, just taking some time to see what an AI generated assignment would score, because if we that can be really helpful for us to identify ways in which we might want to revise the assignment. Okay, anything we want to share before we move on? So I'm going to kind of skip over this a little bit, but this is here for your reference. These are just some examples of ways that we can revise some output. So I'm going to give you all just a few, maybe a minute or so to look this over, 2 minutes. We'll see. Some time to look over the table, and then tell me what you notice about how the assessments were updated. So what were the changes that are represented in that updated artifacts column?
I see in the updated artifacts that it's a little, well, not a little, that it's more dynamic and that it's more humanized versus being focused on the output and being formal in the response, whether it is a discussion or an essay or a short answer. It still seems more formal or stuffy versus in the updated form is more dynamic and more engaging, more focused on the interaction and the representation of that knowledge rather than individual. So it is a little bit more also on the collective understanding and cross-referencing or bouncing it back between the class or the group and the activity versus more individually focused.
Thank you, Kalina. Yeah, that I think that's a really good point, that there's that opportunity for collective, there's the discussions, and then the small groups and the humanized approaches, right? Anything else we notice about ways that these were updated?
Yeah, I'll add to that. I was listening on my phone, so I missed a bunch until I just got home. But I mean, these are all awesome. I love that there's so much that's in class. My concern, and maybe Alex, again, this is just because I teach English and writing, is how much of this I could really do.
Mhm.
certainly there's room for short presentations and group work and maybe one I do have like an artifact multimedia research project, but it's never the whole. I just don't know if it could take place for the majority of the assessments, you know what I mean? I
Yeah.
wish it could, but again, I have to teach writing, so
Right, right.
yeah.
And that's, it's such an impacted field, right? Like, teaching writing, um, this is a huge disruptor. But there is, I don't know if you were here when I was going over this one. Let me pull it up really quickly. Um, oh, here. So
Mhm.
this article, the We Must Still Make Students Write, talks about like AI and composition. And I can give you the link to it as well, if you'd like.
Yeah,
It's
I'll read
really,
it.
really good. But I would say, oops, I did the wrong. Oh, well, it's going to be a very long link, so it's not the prettiest.
Not bad.
Okay. But one of the things that I think is really like would make your life a lot easier would be to think about taking some of the prompts for your assignments, putting them into ChatGPT and Gemini, seeing what kind of outputs come out, and then just developing a sense for, what how it would score on the assessment, because you need to teach students to write. That's your job, that's the class, right? And so taking a chance to kind of explore, like, what would a ChatGPT essay score on this, and then what are some ways to tweak the prompt so that it would be a lot harder for the student to simply copy and paste the prompt, and be able to get an A paper. And that can be really focusing on things like integration of the class discussions or the lectures, integration of specific like videos or things like that, that the tool will not have access to. Does
Yeah, that's
that,
good.
okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Because I don't know if I already said this to you all, but I was playing around with some, another issue that's been coming up has been discussion posts. Um, and a lot of folks have noticed that the discussion posts don't necessarily feel like student writing, like it just kind of sounds different, right? And so I was playing around with it with with a colleague, and she took one of her prompts, and ChatGPT wrote a perfect discussion post, really, really good, in like, 2 seconds. But there was another discussion post she put in that required students to watch a video. And then after that video, to think about the reading from the textbook that week and then respond. And that was, I mean, the post that came out was generic. It wouldn't score very well. Um, and so that's where we can really save ourselves a lot of time in the long run, and also make sure that our students are learning the things we want them to learn in our classes. Okay. All right. So if we do want to allow AI, there's lots of different ways that we can do that. And in some classes and for some assessments, allowing AI can be really appropriate and can really, create an engaging experience for our students. In other cases, it may not be appropriate, and we may not want to allow AI on specific assessments. But if we do want to use AI, these are some examples of ways in which we can kind of adapt an assignment for that. So I'll let you all look at this and then kind of share what stands out to you about the updated assessments.
I really appreciate so the assessment number one at the very top, so where students have to write an argument supporting a political party. And so this assignment is really encouraging students to provide detailed prompts with like several layers, organization, nuanced questions to really create unique outputs and compelling arguments. I think this type of assessment is really forcing students to not take the easy way out where they only feed it one prompt, but they haven't done enough personalizing to it. They haven't done enough critical thinking. And I love the specifics and the parameters. So the updated assessment says you have to go 5 rounds, and that means you have to feed it 5 prompts. So, or 5 rebuttals, whatever the prompting, however they need to construct the argument. This, yeah, I love that it also tackles 3 of the Bloom levels too. So yeah, this is really interesting. I love this updated assessment too.
Yeah, and I think it's so I think you called out something really important, that it's really like providing students a chance to see what's possible with these tools, because just copying and pasting a prompt is not, getting the most out of these tools. And it's also not really helping students learn. But in this case, when you're really thinking about it, it can be a really helpful learning partner. Yeah. Yeah. And again, that's not applicable to all classes or all assignments. And it's going to be different for everybody.